Senior Capstone, a web database for backcountry hunters and anglers. So to start, what is BHA? Backcountry Hunters and Anglers is a nonprofit organization that fights for public lands across North America. They want to make sure that you, the common person, has access to public land to do whatever recreational activities you'd like. How I got involved, I was looking to become a member for BHA last summer, and I noticed that they had a section on their website for student research. Knowing I had thesis coming up, I reached out with a letter and my resume to see if I could get anywhere. Shortly after, I was contacted by their collegiate club coordinator, who was excited to get the wheels turning and find a way that we could come to work together and work on something that benefited them and doubled as my thesis. So the first thing me and my customer needed to do was identify a problem. We started by discussing my skill set and idea I had to aid their donor experience, and we discussed my customer's job as the collegiate club coordinator, where they were essentially taking in loads of data from clubs, students, meetings, and things like that, and they had no way of managing it. We decided that they clearly needed a database management system, so we set out to complete that. To move forward and discuss how we were going to do this, we decided we needed to form a sort of process. So we scheduled meetings on a weekly and bi-weekly basis. And essentially what went on in these meetings is I would come with a list of questions, I would get answers, I would give information, and I would get information back. And then in between meetings, I would do a bunch of work and present my customer with that information. Once we had a good idea of what the customer wanted in a product, there were still some massive hurdles we had to get around. The first was that I had to start from scratch and finding out which way would be the best way to organize all their data to minimize redundancy, but still contain all the necessary information. Outside of how we would be organizing the data, my customer was still unsure about the features/functionality they would want and which ones would be most beneficial to them. One of the biggest influences and issues to start on this project was whether or not my customer would be willing to be spending money on this project or not to cover the cost of a web server for their database management system. I did not have an answer immediately, so I planned courses for both options until I got one. We will discuss this more in depth on my technology slide. So to combat these issues, my customer provided me with a lot of documentation that she typically gets from these clubs. We were still unsure on whether we were going to do a relational or a non-relational database management system, but as I was starting to make sense of this data, I thought it would be helpful to develop an ER diagram and schema regardless, just so we could see how these tables would look. And then to combat what else we were going to add to the website, I had my user make a priority-based list for the features and functionality she would want. And then finally, we came to the conclusion that a web-based database would be best for what we were doing. Here you'll see how I was able to organize that documentation into an ER diagram with 8 entities, where the club is spanning out to pretty much everything. We'll see that the club spans out in a way that it's either 0 to many or 1 to many of these. So that means that club ID would be appearing as a foreign key in these tables. The schema is essentially just a layout of how these tables would appear in SQL. You'll see that the club ID is in a dotted underline as the foreign key in many of these. And then one thing worth noting is at the bottom we have a student run social media account join table, as that is a many-to-many relationship. One of the biggest decisions that was made for this project was what framework I was going to use to build my backend, whether I'd use a traditional relational database framework like SQL or a non-relational database like Firebase's real-time database. One of the biggest factors that went into this decision was that my customer determined that they would not be able to spend any money on this project. If I were to go the relational database route, I was looking into using Oracle as a web server host for my MySQL-based database, which does have a free plan, but it was pretty limited compared to Firebase's free plan, which we ended up coming to a consensus on. What we sacrificed in not having a relational database using MySQL was the ability to write super powerful queries, and our data would be more redundant as we wouldn't have things like a join table for student run social media account, and club ID wouldn't be appearing as foreign keys in many of those tables. However, my user determined that this trade-off would be worth it, as they did not already possess the knowledge to write the level of queries they might want to utilize, and they did not plan on learning this anytime soon. But what we gained from using Firebase to run our database was also its website hosting, its file storage, and its user authentication on top of the real-time database we are already using all in one environment. Not only did having all of these offered off of one platform save me from figuring out how I'd cover all of those individually, but I'd also be able to use all of these on Firebase's free plan, which offers high thresholds for usage within each of these 4 categories that my user would not break. So we'll talk about more about those thresholds in my actual demonstration where I'm able to show you them in the Firebase console. But on top of this, Firebase also just had a ton of documentation and very detailed tutorials that kind of finally encouraged me that this is what I wanted to use. You can see in this actual slide on the left, this is an actual screenshot from our real-time database that we used for this project, and you can see how the data is organized in that. And then on the right, you can see how it's organized in a SQL-based database. The factors that went into me choosing my front end to build the UI portion of my project had much less weight on the project relative to my back end. My user did not have a ton of specific UI requests besides a website that was clean and easy to navigate. That being said, I immediately started looking into Angular and React as they are two of the most popular open source front end frameworks being used today. The biggest appeal to me with React is that its component-based structure was extremely easy to follow, and I felt that I could organize my project before I started working on it and while I was working on it in a much easier manner than opposed to Angular. This is because Angular is based upon 3 layers, which are models, views, and controllers, which I thought might be a little harder to organize with. React is based on JavaScript JSX, which makes it easier to write HTML in React-based code. So think of it kind of as a mash of the two within the JavaScript files you're writing. I also found a plethora of resources of people integrating Firebase with React and great documentation on React's website that confirmed to me it was what I wanted to use. At the beginning of this project, I really struggled with getting Firebase and React to communicate properly, along with deploying my website for the first time. Part of this was due to my lack of understanding and experience with these frameworks, but also because a lot of Firebase's documentation for their free tier is old and not updated. I quickly learned this when I first properly deployed my website, and then I got a warning message notifying me that Firebase was deprecating the use of Node version 10 on Firebase's free hosting plan in March of 2021. You also were not allowed to use a Node version higher than 10 with their free plan. Because of this, I would have to adapt, as it would not support hosting or functions anymore while I was working on this project. After talking to my customer, we upgraded to the Firebase Blaze plan, which allowed me to host on Node version 12 and use its functions. While we were off the free plan, we were still in the clear on the project being free, as long as we would stay under those free thresholds mentioned earlier. And the main reason that this site would stay in this free threshold is that it just simply wouldn't have as much traffic compared to like a social network platform, for example. I also set the Firebase plan to send an email alerting the project managers at any time if the project accrues any cost for whatever reason, so it can be resolved promptly, which helped me sleep a little easier at night as my debit card was now tied to this project. But I discovered how Firebase does really handcuff you if you want to use hosting under their free plan. Disclaimer: none of the information you're about to see in this demonstration is true. It is all solely made up by me to fill the database and demonstrate what it might look like when a customer is using it. Alright, so for the demo, we'll just go through what a full session for my user might look like. Notice that this is the actual hosted website. If my user chooses to buy a domain, they can, otherwise it'll stay as this. The first thing I wanted to point out was just a security feature I added, since this will be containing important information that they probably just want to keep to themselves. If you try to go to a different route within the actual website and you're not logged in, you'll be redirected back to the login page. Another thing worth noting is that the sign up feature here is on it now, but when I deliver it to my customer, it actually won't be. So that'll make sure that only the people that should have access to this website will, and they can manage all the authentication for like who has access and stuff through Firebase, which we'll talk about. But for the sake of this demo, we're going to go through it. The forgot password also works. So I'll just make an account. And I'll sign in. So now here we're on Firebase's Authentication tab. You'll see these are all the accounts that are linked to this website. You'll see the one that we made is right here. When I get rid of the sign up feature, my user will still be able to add other people that they work with through this, or they can delete them. So that'll ensure that only the people that should have access to this information will actually be having access to it. Alright, so now we're on the home page of the website. My user requested that I display kind of statistics about the actual database itself on an easy to access location on the website. So I told her I had room on the front page, and that's what we decided on. So here we just have some stats about the actual database itself. On the left, I made a kind of a visual representation of all these stats. I really enjoyed making this visual representation. I thought it was cool. If I had more time on this project, or maybe this summer, I'd like to do some more stuff like this. Alright, so now we'll get into the actual database itself. The first thing you'll notice is the top row. These are the 8 entities I divided the database into. So those are where the tables will all be. Below this, these are all queries I wrote for my customer. Since they decided that they would not like to write them themselves, we kind of talked about 3 ones that might be super useful for them. So here, this is a list of all the treasurers for all the clubs. So she can click on that and get all of them. With this one, she can get a list of all the presidents. And then this one, she can get fundraisers that have raised more than $500. Alright, so now we'll go into the actual tables. We'll go into the clubs first. It's worth noting that these are extremely similar to the tables you saw in the schema. The IDs are not displayed in any of these tables, as me and my customer just thought it kind of clogged up the page and wasn't necessary. But when we go into the actual Firebase database, you'll see that they do have auto-assigned IDs. So we'll go ahead and add a school. We'll leave that typo for the demo's sake, but we'll give it a date here. Alright, so we just added that club. If we go into our Firebase real-time database, we can see that in our schools, there is an addition. And there it is. We'll see that there's an error right there with a typo. So we can use our pagination to go to the end here. We can use our edit button to edit that. We'll make that quick change. We'll update the club. We'll see that it's been changed there. In our Firebase real-time database, it has also been changed. Finally, the last functionality on this is just the delete functionality. So we can get rid of this club by clicking on the trash can right here. It is now gone, and it is now gone from our database. So now we can continue going through the tables. We'll see in students that the club ID is not a foreign key like it would be in a relational database, but I just attached on the name of each club onto the students here, so we can go through here. We can continue going through the tables. These are the faculty advisors. See the club right here that's tied to each of them. They all have the delete and edit functions, as well as adding them up here. There's fundraisers. I think an important thing to note is that my user will have summaries for the fundraisers, so these columns are able to adjust. But it's also worth noting that for my pagination, I put in less amount of data per page on each table, just to kind of mitigate the fact that summaries could be really long. We'll continue into transactions. These also contain summaries, work service projects, social media, and then meetings. So those are all the tables that my users will be using to store all their data. We can go back into the database here, and you'll see within the actual BHA web database that these are all children in it, and those were also in all the tables. The only exception is the file data, and that's where we'll be heading next to explain. Alright, so now we'll move on to the club home. I think the first thing that's worth noting is we talked about how my customer was keeping track of a lot of reminders and information on sticky notes, so I actually kind of made a sticky note feature for her where she can select a drop down. This will give her a list of every club, so she can go on a club and she can add and delete some reminders for herself, so she can switch between clubs. She can switch here. You can add a note, text the president. Once she's done with that, she can delete it. The notes are also stored inside our real-time database right in here. See that they have the club and the club note. Alright, now that we've added and deleted some reminders for ourselves, we can go over here into the club file section, and this is pretty much just an area where my customer can store all the files she has just pertaining to these clubs. So she can go in, she can select a file, she can upload it. There's a progress bar up here. It went pretty quick just because it's a super small file. Then she has the option to click on these, so she can click on this. It'll download to her computer and she can pull it up quickly. Here's an image right here. She can click on that. She can see this image. So it's just kind of a place for her to store all those files. If we go in here, we can see that if we refresh the page, this is within our Firebase storage, that now that document that we just added has been added to our Firebase storage page. I think this is important to note that this is not within the real-time database section of Firebase. This is in its storage where you can manage files. So right here I just have an area called files that I can click in and see all the files pertaining to the website. But like I said, I do have this file data also copied and stored into an array in my real-time database, just so I can loop through that array and display it on my UI, and then my user will be able to have access to these files stored in the database. And then finally, my user can manage their files just by going in and deleting them with the trash can logo. So that covers all the functionality for the website. Finally, once my user is done with their section, we can log out, and it brings us back to the login screen. I want to touch a little bit on talking about keeping this project free, as obviously that's necessary. So these are kind of the thresholds we talked about earlier. I haven't used this website extremely heavily in the last month, as far as, and that's what it goes by month. I haven't added a ton of data to this in the last month, but what you can see is these are all extremely low for what I have added. I think when my user peaks will be when they first get the database, obviously, because that's when they'll be uploading a lot of information initially, so you might see these numbers spike a little bit, but I think the highest I ever got any of these to was 5%, and I think that was in downloads and hosting. So I think my users should be good. I have no reason to believe that they will even come close to touching any of these thresholds, but I thought this would be worth showing so you can kind of see with the amount of data that I have in the website right now, right where I am with these thresholds. I think the most valuable thing I learned throughout this whole process was just how to develop a relationship with your customer and how that customer developer relationship should work. Most importantly, I realized that questions are the driving force in getting your customer to get across what they want. The way you ask your questions and what you ask questions about really gets your customer to paint a picture for what they want, because they don't always necessarily know what they want. I also learned about myself as a programmer more. I learned that I enjoyed working on backend and functionality features of my website way more than I enjoyed working on CSS and design portions of my website. I also learned that it was important to be consistent, and I formed a daily plan and weekly plans, especially over winter break when I was heavily working on my project, and that helped me stay on task and not half do tasks. And then finally, just never hesitate to ask questions, whether that be to your professors, Stack Overflow, or Reddit. All of them are there to help you, and they're great resources. So if I could do this project again, the biggest thing I would do was just do more research on the Firebase real-time database and the Firebase Cloud Firestore database, just to see how they were different and if the Firestore offered more to me. On the real-time database, I was unable to find a way to actually display my queries on the user interface, and I was able to find examples where people were using the Cloud Firestore database to do that, but no one was doing it with the real-time database. They were all just logging the results to the console like you see below. The real-time database also doesn't offer very powerful queries. You'll see in this example, I go through my student database and I order by child last name, and then I just get a list of all the last names in alphabetical order. But this is the kind of stuff you're limited to. You can search by key, you can order your results, or you can just state whether you wanted a certain amount of the logs from the front or the back of your query. Um, Also, I just wish I would have looked and saw if Cloud Firestore database would have just been more applicable to my project and offered me more. And then finally, I wish I would have just committed to either using more of Bootstrap or just going full on CSS, because I started using some of both and then they started overriding each other, and that was a huge headache to sort out. Thank you, and I invite you to ask questions about my senior thesis.
Okay, please ask some questions.
I have a question. Earlier last semester, I did send you a link regarding Firebase. Did that help you guide you along what sort of database you were going to use?
Yeah, so it did kind of help me. I think I talked about this in my paper too, but when I was deciding what database to use, Firebase actually has a quiz on if you should use the real-time database or the Cloud Firestore database for your project, and I literally tested right down the middle. So I kind of ended up choosing what I thought would work out best for me. But I mean, as you work on the project and learn more, you kind of wonder what the other one would have offered. And I also met with Professor Mahoney, and we kind of talked about stuff the Cloud Firestore database offered. And at the time, I didn't know that it offered that. So, yeah.
How do you feel on NoSQL type database? Would you use that for your future projects, or would you stick to a more relational database style?
I think I would stick to a more relational database style. And I think part of that is just because I actually really enjoy writing queries. I really enjoyed it in the database class. And with Firebase, you just can't really write like super powerful queries like you can with SQL. So I think that's something I really enjoy. And that's probably something I'd lean towards. But if I started making like, if I made a database that was on like a huge scale and I had tons of information, I would probably go with a non-relational database.
Did you do anything to make the site look good on a mobile phone, a small screen?
No, I didn't. It is pretty dynamic, but my user told me that they would never be using it on their phone, so I just kind of left that out.
Did you think it was easier working with a customer, or do you think you would have it would have been easier if you were doing this by yourself?
No, I don't think it was easier working with a customer, but I'm extremely grateful for that experience of working with a customer because honestly, that was probably one of the most important learning points of me for my project was like learning because my customer really didn't know what they wanted. And I learned like one of the biggest things I learned was like the way I approached each meeting and the information I presented her with could like get across what she actually wanted. And also, it just kind of felt a lot more realistic for me. And I definitely took a lot more passion in the project just because I knew I was delivering a real product that would benefit someone.
So has the customer begun using the development?
Yeah, they have. Last week we met and we talked over it, and they're extremely excited about it. They said that their favorite thing will probably be just being able to store all the files in one place, but they really had no way of organizing any of this data. She had it in a ton of Word documents and Excel documents. So just the fact that she now has a way to organize all this data is pretty big.
Cool. Other questions for Noah?
Did you enjoy doing this, and did it change your future as a computer scientist?
Yeah, I really did enjoy doing this. I don't know. I guess it's kind of early to tell how it would change the future of me as a computer scientist, but I think I definitely realized that I like working on back-end functionality stuff a lot more. So I think in the future, as I look for jobs, like that might be something I keep my eyes out for and maybe kind of stay away from front-end stuff because I found a lot of that to be extremely nitpicky and like it just wasn't exciting to me.
Well, I have some concerns in that we've had 3 students so far who've enjoyed their senior capstone. So I think maybe I did something wrong.
Maybe.
Okay, so everybody, let's give a hand to Noah. Yep. And thank you, Noah. Thank